The rain had been relentless all day. When I landed at Newark International Airport ahead of schedule, I couldn't help but sigh with relief. The weather had forced my flight to be moved up, but now that I was home early, I had a few extra hours to unwind before the evening rush. My wife Lauren had always been a stickler for schedules, so when I saw her car parked in the garage, I figured she was likely in her studio, working on one of her new art projects. She had always been passionate about her paintings, though I rarely saw much progress on them. Still, I supported her, just as I had supported her decision to stop working after we got married. She told me countless times that her art was her calling, and I had always believed it, until today. I walked up to the master bedroom and started unpacking my bag. My mind wandered as I kicked off my shoes, and something about the quiet of the house seemed off. I moved toward the dresser, and there, right on top of the drawer, was her laptop, open as usual. Without thinking, I grabbed it. We shared passwords, always had, and it never occurred to me that there might be anything I shouldn't see. I didn't even think about it at first, but when I saw the email sitting in her inbox, the subject line jumped out at me: updated asset analysis. The sender was unfamiliar, Tom Richardson, an attorney. For a moment I thought about closing the laptop and leaving. I didn't want to invade her privacy. But something in my gut told me to look closer. There was a cold, nagging instinct pushing me to do something I hadn't ever done before. So I clicked. The email opened, and I read the first few lines that nearly knocked the breath from my chest. It was a divorce lawyer's letter. The attorney was outlining a strategy for Lauren to claim half of our assets. According to the email, she had been meeting with this lawyer for the past few months, planning to separate me from the company I had built from the ground up. It didn't just stop there. The email mentioned the exact amount she expected to walk away with, $150 million. I felt like the world had just collapsed in on me. The email continued, detailing her lawyer's approach to demonstrating her emotional support during the early years of the company's growth, and how they planned to use her role as the manager of the household to claim a large portion of the marital estate. I closed the laptop slowly, trying to steady my breath. For a long moment I stood there holding my overnight bag, not knowing what to do. It didn't hit me all at once. I didn't feel rage. No, instead I felt something I hadn't expected: clarity. A strange, cold clarity washed over me. I had spent years building my business. I had worked 80 to 100-hour weeks, sacrificed everything to get to this point. And now, the person I thought I could trust more than anyone in the world was planning to take everything I'd built and leave me with nothing. This wasn't just a betrayal. This was a calculated move. I couldn't let it happen. I turned and walked out of the bedroom, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. The rain was still pouring outside, but it felt like the storm in my life had just begun. I knew I had to think fast. I couldn't let Lauren get away with this. With one final glance at the closed laptop, I knew I had to prepare for what was coming next. I had been blind to what she had been plotting for months, but now I wasn't going to let her blindside me again. I had my business to protect, and I wasn't about to lose everything to a plan that was already in motion. I had to act now. I stood in the living room trying to make sense of everything. The house was silent, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, maybe the shock to wear off, or maybe a moment of clarity that would help me decide what to do next. Lauren's studio was just down the hall, and I knew she was in there, probably painting or sketching, lost in her world of colors and canvases. I, on the other hand, was now stuck in a nightmare of legal jargon and betrayal. I needed to keep it together, to stay calm. If there was one thing I knew how to do, it was think strategically. I'd been doing it for years in my business, and now I had to do it in my personal life. I didn't rush upstairs to confront Lauren immediately. No, I needed time to think. I had to process what I had just discovered. And I knew there was one person I could trust to help me: David Moore, my attorney. David had been with me through the roughest parts of building my business. He'd structured my contracts, helped negotiate deals, and was the one person who knew every detail of my financial life. I grabbed my phone and called him. "David, it's Jason. I need to meet with you, and it's urgent." David answered quickly. "I'm free in an hour. Let's meet at the office. I'll get everything ready." I didn't waste time. In less than an hour, I was sitting in David's conference room, a glass of water in front of me, but my mind was miles away. I handed him the printout of the email I'd found. As he read through it, his brow furrowed, but he remained calm, just like I needed him to be. "So, she's been planning this for months," he said, leaning back in his chair after finishing the email. "And she's been working with a lawyer. This isn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision." I nodded. "She thinks she has everything figured out. But she doesn't know I know. And I need to make sure she doesn't get away with this. David was quiet for a moment, then he stood up, his face now more serious than before. Jason, we need to move fast. If she's got an attorney already, they're going to try to make this as difficult as possible. But there are things we can do to protect your assets. I didn't need to hear the rest of his plan to know what was at stake. Everything I had worked for could be on the line. My company, my wealth, my future. But there was something else I knew deep down. I wouldn't let her take it all. I couldn't. Tell me what we need to do, I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. David nodded. First, we need to move quickly. We need to restructure your holdings and transfer some of your assets into trust. Keep them out of her reach. You've built this business from the ground up, Jason. No one is going to take it away from you, not without a fight. I agreed. I didn't need to be told twice. I had built this company from scratch, and I wasn't going to let her walk away with it because she decided she didn't want to be married anymore. David continued outlining the steps we would take, explaining the process of moving assets, setting up trusts, and protecting the company from any legal claims. It all sounded like a business transaction to me, which in a way it was. But it wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. It was about protecting what I had worked so hard for. By the time our meeting ended, I had a clear course of action. It was time to make the first move. I left the office and drove back home, my mind racing. I knew Lauren would have her lawyer's strategy already in place. She was meticulous, and this wasn't the first time she had planned something behind my back. But this time I was ready. When I walked back into the house, the silence greeted me once again. I could hear the faint sound of Lauren moving in her studio, the soft scrape of her brush on the canvas. It seemed so normal, so peaceful, too peaceful. But I knew it wouldn't last. The storm was coming and I had to be prepared. I went upstairs to our bedroom, placed the laptop back exactly where I had found it, and changed into something more comfortable. As I looked at the empty space beside me on the bed, I couldn't help but feel a pang of loss. We had built this life together, at least I thought we had. But now it was a different story. I stood by the window staring out at the city lights, lost in thought. Lauren had no idea I knew. She was still thinking she had the upper hand. She was still planning on blindsiding me. But I wasn't the same man who had started out as a junior programmer. I had learned how to protect myself in the world of business, and now I was going to use that same skill to protect everything I had worked for. Tomorrow I would call my financial advisor and start the process of moving the money. Tomorrow I would take control of the situation. But tonight I just had to survive the silence. The next morning I woke up early. The sky was still gray from the rain the night before, and the house was eerily quiet. Lauren was already up, or at least I assumed she was. I hadn't heard her moving around yet, but she was always up early, painting, sketching, or organizing her art supplies in the studio. I stood for a moment by the bedroom window, staring out at the fog settling over the city. Everything in my life had felt so stable just days ago. But now I was navigating a war zone, and the enemy was the woman I once trusted most. I couldn't help but replay the moment I found that email over and over in my mind. The betrayal stung, but the rage hadn't fully hit me yet. I was still too focused on the plan. The strategy. I had learned a long time ago that emotions could be dangerous when you were fighting for something that mattered. I grabbed my phone and called my financial advisor, Stephanie. She had been helping me manage my wealth for years, and I trusted her implicitly. She answered on the second ring. Jason, she said, sounding groggy. It's early, is everything okay? I need to move quickly on something, I replied, keeping my tone calm. I need to restructure my holdings, shift some assets. It's urgent. There was a pause on the other end, and then Stephanie replied with a sharpness that I appreciated. Okay, let's meet at the office in an hour. I'll pull up your files and we'll get this sorted. I didn't waste a minute. I showered, grabbed a quick breakfast, and headed straight for the office. The drive felt like a blur, my mind racing with every detail I had to work through. The reality of the situation was setting in, but there wasn't time for hesitation. I needed to act fast before Lauren could make her next move. When I arrived at the office, Stephanie was already waiting for me. She looked up from her laptop as I walked in, her expression immediately turning serious. Jason, I've already started pulling the relevant documents, she said, motioning to the papers spread out across her desk. Let's start with the basics. What's the plan? I took a deep breath and sat down. I need to transfer a portion of my assets, holdings, investments, properties, into structures that Lauren can't access. I know she's working with an attorney, and I don't want to get caught off guard. I need to make sure this is legal but airtight. Stephanie nodded. Understood. We'll use the trusts and offshore accounts we've talked about. You've got some separate properties and equity that should remain untouchable, but we'll need to document everything carefully. She outlined a strategy that would involve moving about 40% of my assets into irrevocable trusts and corporate structures, ensuring that they were well protected from any claim in the divorce. It was risky, especially if Lauren decided to fight in court, but it was my best chance of holding on to what I had built. Stephanie and I worked through the details, making sure that every asset was accounted for and that the paperwork was flawless. I made decisions quickly as if I were drafting contracts for a major deal. Each step was calculated, deliberate. The time pressure was real, but I had no choice. I couldn't let her win this game. By the time we finished, I felt like I had taken the first step in securing my future. The legal framework was in place and all I had to do now was wait. But as I drove home later that day, a thought gnawed at me. Was I really doing the right thing? Was I just protecting my wealth, or was I closing myself off emotionally from the life I had shared with Lauren? We had built something together, hadn't we? Or had I been too focused on my company to see what was really happening with her? When I walked back into the house, it was again quiet. Lauren was in the studio, her back to the door. She was painting as usual, lost in her world. She didn't even look up when I entered. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation. But I knew that would be playing into her hands. She still thought she had the element of surprise, but I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. I wasn't going to be blindsided again. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a drink and sat down. The weight of everything seemed heavier now, but I knew what I had to do next. This battle was just beginning and I had to be smart. Lauren finally came into the kitchen an hour later, her eyes bright from her work, but when she saw me, her smile faltered for just a second. "You're home early," she said, her voice light as if nothing had changed. "How was the meeting in the city?" "It was fine," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I've been thinking about taking a trip next month. We haven't had a real vacation in ages. How about a getaway to the Hamptons? You could use some time off." Her eyes narrowed for a moment, but she quickly masked her reaction with a smile. "That sounds nice. Let's talk about it this weekend." She didn't know it yet, but by the time we reached the weekend, everything would have changed. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. I spent the next few days walking a fine line. Lauren and I carried on like everything was normal. I went to work, came home to dinner, talked about our daughter's plans for the weekend, and discussed her art show that was coming up. All the while, I was moving pieces into place, meticulously, quietly, as if nothing had changed. But inside I was anything but calm. Each night, I would lie awake beside Lauren, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the email I'd found, the plan that was already in motion. I could see it clearly now. She had been preparing for this moment for months. The timing was everything. She had waited until my company had grown to its peak, until my wealth had multiplied beyond my wildest expectations. Then, when I thought everything was finally falling into place, she had decided it was time to cash in. I wasn't just angry at the betrayal. I was furious that she had believed I would be too absorbed in my work to notice her plans. That she thought she could manipulate me, catch me off guard. But now I had the upper hand. I had protected my assets, hidden them in a way that Lauren wouldn't be able to touch. But even so, the uncertainty gnawed at me. Was she going to fight? Was she going to push this to the courts, make it a long, drawn-out battle? I knew her well enough to know that she could be relentless when she wanted something. If she pushed too far, I'd have no choice but to play the game her way, but I would do it on my terms. On the 5th day after my meeting with David, I went to see my personal attorney again. I needed reassurance, needed to know that I had done everything I could to protect myself. David greeted me with his usual calm professionalism. "How are we feeling today?" he asked, motioning for me to sit down. "Better," I said, though I didn't feel it. "I've done what I can on my end. The transfers are complete, the trusts are in place. But there's something I need to know. What's the worst-case scenario here? If she files, what's my exposure?" David leaned back in his chair and paused for a moment. "You're in a strong position. The assets you've moved into trust are well protected. The court won't be able to touch them. And the company structure is solid. She has no claim to it. But of course that doesn't mean she won't fight it. People often don't like being told no, especially when they've spent months thinking they had everything planned out." I nodded, absorbing his words. It was exactly what I had expected to hear, but hearing it from him made it feel more real. "And if she tries to drag this through court?" I asked. David's eyes hardened slightly. "If she goes that route, it'll be expensive for her. Litigation costs add up quickly, and the longer it goes, the more she'll have to spend. Your position is solid. She doesn't have much to stand on. But make no mistake, this will get ugly. And that's the point where you'll need to decide if you want to settle or fight. The idea of fighting didn't sit well with me. I wanted this over. I wanted to protect my company, my future, but I didn't want it to turn into a war. Still, I knew I had to prepare for the worst. If Lauren wanted a battle, she would get one. As I left the office, I felt a cold sense of inevitability settle in. Lauren didn't know it yet, but her plan was already falling apart. She had assumed that I was too absorbed in my work to notice. But now it was my turn to take control. When I walked through the front door that evening, Lauren was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. The scent of garlic filled the air as she hummed a tune to herself. She didn't look up when I entered. "Dinner smells good," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Thanks. Just trying out a new recipe," she replied, her back still turned to me. I stood there for a moment, watching her. She had no idea that her whole world was about to change. She still thought she was in control. She still thought she could manipulate me. But she didn't know what I had already done. I walked into the living room, poured myself a drink, and sat down. The quiet of the house surrounded me, but inside I was anything but calm. I had done everything I could to protect myself. Now, all that was left was waiting for her to make her move. And when she did, I'd be ready. The days dragged on, each one feeling heavier than the last. Lauren and I kept up the charade, talking about our daughter's graduation, discussing plans for the house as if nothing had changed. But every time I saw her, a tight knot would form in my chest. She had no idea what was coming, but I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face the truth head-on. It came on a Thursday afternoon. I had just returned from a meeting downtown when I saw Lauren's car parked in the driveway. It was strange that she was home so early. Usually she'd be at her studio working on one of her pieces. Something about the timing felt off. I walked inside and the house was eerily quiet. I called out, "Lauren?" But there was no response. I took a few steps further into the house, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, the kind you get when you know something's wrong but can't quite place it. Finally, I found her in the kitchen. She was standing at the counter, her back turned to me, preparing dinner. Her usual smile wasn't there. She didn't even acknowledge me when I walked in. It felt like the calm before a storm. I stood still for a moment, watching her. I had to confront her now. I had no choice. But the question lingered, how would she react? Would she be defensive? Would she deny it all and act as if I was imagining things? I cleared my throat. "We need to talk." She paused for a moment, the knife in her hand resting against the cutting board. Slowly she turned around, her face unreadable. "About what?" I took a step closer, my voice steady but firm. "I know what you've been planning. I know about the divorce, the lawyer, the assets." For a brief moment, her eyes flashed with surprise. But it was gone so quickly that I almost wondered if I had imagined it. She set the knife down, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in front of her. "Jason, her voice faltered. "I didn't think you'd find out." I felt a cold calm settle over me. This was it. The moment I'd been dreading. But now that it had come, it felt strangely controlled, like I was watching it unfold from the outside. "You've been planning this for months," I said, my voice quiet but sharp. "You've been talking to your lawyer, documenting our assets, figuring out how to get half of everything I've worked for. I know about the emails, the analysis." Lauren took a shaky breath, her eyes not quite meeting mine. She looked like she was trying to find the right words, but I didn't give her the chance. "You thought you could blindside me, didn't you?" I continued. "You thought I wouldn't notice, that I'd just be too caught up in my work to see what was really happening in my own home." She opened her mouth as if to say something, but nothing came out. Instead, she just stared at me, her face pale. The woman who had once been my partner in this life, who had been beside me through the struggles and the successes, now looked like a stranger. "I never wanted to hurt you, Jason," she finally said, her voice small. I didn't know what else to do. I gave up everything for you, my career, my dreams. I supported you while you built this company, and now I feel like I have nothing. I deserve something. Don't I?" Her words hit me like a slap. I felt a surge of anger mixed with something else. Disappointment, perhaps, or the final realization that the person I thought I knew so well had been hiding behind a mask this whole time. "You gave up your career?" I asked, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "You worked at a design firm for 3 years before quitting to be an artist. You stopped working because you wanted to. I supported you through that. I never once asked you to contribute financially. I never held it against you. But this is a betrayal." I took a step closer, my chest tightening. You think you're entitled to half of what I've built just because you stood by my side while I did the work? You think you deserve $150 million because you were married to me? Lauren's face softened, but the tears didn't come. It's not just about the money, Jason. It's about everything I sacrificed. I've spent the last 20 years supporting you, managing our home, being there when you needed someone. It's not just about the business. It's about what we built together. I shook my head, the anger bubbling up now. What we built together. You never contributed to the company. You weren't there in the trenches with me. You didn't help me build the relationships that made this company what it is. You weren't there when I was working 80-hour weeks. You didn't sacrifice anything. You were comfortable living off of what I provided. She winced as if my words stung, but she didn't say anything. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between us. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "So what now? What happens to us?" I stood there for a moment, trying to compose myself. I had always prided myself on being able to stay calm in any situation, but this was different. This wasn't just business anymore. This was personal. "I've already taken steps to protect myself," I said, my voice steady. "I've moved assets, Lauren. I've made sure that what I've worked for is legally protected. You're not getting half of everything just because you think you're entitled to it." The room seemed to freeze in that moment. I could see the shock on her face, the realization of what I had done. She had no idea how far I had gone to protect myself. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence in the kitchen was thick, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. "You've been planning this all along, haven't you?" "You knew." I nodded slowly. "I knew as soon as I found the emails. And I've been preparing ever since." Lauren's eyes filled with tears, but this time, there was no sympathy from me. I had no pity left for her. She had made her choices, and now she would have to live with them. "Well," she said quietly, wiping her eyes, "I guess there's nothing left to say, is there?" I met her gaze, the anger still burning inside me, but there was something else too. Sadness. For the person she had become. For the marriage we had built, now falling apart before my eyes. "No," I said softly. "I guess there isn't." And with that, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her standing there, the woman I once loved, now a stranger. The days after our confrontation passed slowly. Every moment felt like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The house felt more like a battleground than a home, and every time I saw Lauren, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a strange sense of loss. She didn't bring up the divorce again. There were no more discussions about money or the future. We lived in a strange silence, as if the world had paused for a moment, holding its breath. But I knew it wouldn't last forever. I threw myself into work, focusing on what I could control. My company still needed me, still needed my vision and leadership. The contracts kept coming, the deals kept going through. But inside I felt hollow. The business I had spent years building now seemed like the only thing that kept me grounded. And as much as I told myself it was all for the future, I couldn't ignore the truth. The marriage, the life I had once thought was solid, was falling apart. One evening, about a week after our argument, I came home later than usual. I had been in meetings all day and I barely had the energy to think straight. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Lauren's car was still parked outside. The house was dark, save for a light in the kitchen. I walked in quietly, not wanting to disturb her if she was working in her studio again. But as I rounded the corner into the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. Lauren was sitting at the table, a glass of wine in front of her. She was staring at her phone, her fingers slowly scrolling. For a moment I thought she hadn't noticed me. But then she looked up. Her face was softer than I had seen it in days, as though the tension had finally broken. "Hey," she said softly. "I didn't hear you come in." I nodded but didn't say anything. I could see that she was trying to make peace, but I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. After everything that had happened, it felt almost impossible to just let it go. "You're still here," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I thought you might be out celebrating your success." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to throw it all back in her face. The betrayal, the lies, everything she had done. But another part of me just wanted to walk away. "I'm still here," I said finally, my voice calm. "And I'm still taking care of the business. You should know that by now." Lauren looked down at her wine glass, her fingers tracing the rim. I could feel the tension rising between us again, like a storm just beneath the surface. She wasn't the same woman I had married. This woman was cold, calculating. And yet, there was something different in her eyes now, a vulnerability I hadn't seen in weeks. "Jason," she said quietly, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About the company, about the money. And I realized something. I raised an eyebrow. What's that? I didn't want to be just the wife anymore, she said, almost as if she were talking to herself. I didn't want to be the one in the background supporting you while you built your empire. I wanted to be a part of it. I wanted something for myself, something I could hold on to. But now I see that I've lost more than I realized. Her voice trailed off and I felt a pang of something, maybe guilt. Maybe it was the woman she had been before everything went south, the one I had loved. But in that moment, I knew I had already made my decision. It was too late to go back. The trust between us had been shattered. I gave you everything I could, I said, my voice firm. But you crossed a line when you started plotting behind my back. You made a choice, Lauren. You chose to betray me. And now we have to deal with the consequences. Lauren's face hardened again, but there was a fleeting moment where I thought I saw regret in her eyes. She quickly masked it, her expression turning distant. I never wanted this to happen, she said, her voice almost pleading. I never wanted to hurt you. But I don't know how to fix it now. I don't know if I can fix it. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I just watched her, trying to figure out if there was anything left to salvage. But deep down, I knew. There was nothing left. Maybe it's time for both of us to move on, I said quietly. She looked up at me, her eyes wide, almost as if she hadn't expected me to say it. I could see the shock in her face, the realization that the end had come. It wasn't a conversation we had ever planned for. But now that it was happening, it felt inevitable. I'll talk to my lawyer, she said after a long pause. And I'll make sure this goes smoothly. I don't want to fight. Her words felt hollow and I wasn't sure if she meant them. But I wasn't going to wait for her to decide. I had already taken steps to protect myself, and if she wanted a clean break, I was ready to give it to her. I'm not looking for a fight either, I replied. I just want this to be over. She nodded, and for the first time in weeks, the air between us felt lighter. But that lightness didn't bring relief. It only made the situation feel even more final. It was over. Lauren stood up, her wine glass empty now. I'll let you know when I'm ready to file, she said, turning to leave the room. I watched her walk away, the door to her studio creaking as she closed it behind her. It felt like the end of an era. The marriage I had worked so hard to build had crumbled, and the woman I had loved was now just a stranger. As I stood there in the quiet of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. I had won the battle for my company. But the cost had been higher than I could have ever imagined. The next few days passed in a blur. Lauren and I barely exchanged words. She kept to herself and I did the same. It was a strange sort of peace, as if we were both preparing for the inevitable storm, but neither of us was quite ready to face it. I spent most of my time at the office, throwing myself into work. The company needed me, and truthfully, it was the only thing that kept me grounded. I couldn't afford to let emotions get in the way of my decisions now, not when everything I had worked for was at risk. But no matter how much I tried to immerse myself in the business, there was always a voice in the back of my head reminding me of what was happening at home. What was happening to my marriage? To my life? Lauren didn't seem interested in talking about the divorce any further. She wasn't pushing the issue, which made me suspect she was waiting for me to make the next move. Maybe she thought I'd be the one to initiate the next step, or maybe she just wanted me to make the decision for her. Either way, I knew it wouldn't be long before the inevitable came. The hardest part was still not knowing how this would unfold. I had already taken steps to protect my assets, but would Lauren agree to a fair settlement? Or would she fight me at every turn? Every time I thought about it, my mind filled with doubts. She had never been someone who backed down easily. If she felt slighted, she could drag this out for years. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. A few days later, I came home to find Lauren sitting at the kitchen table again, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. The house was quieter than usual, and her demeanor was calmer than it had been in days. I stood at the doorway for a moment, watching her, wondering what she was thinking. When she noticed me, she smiled faintly, but it didn't reach her eyes. I've been doing some thinking, she said, her voice soft. About everything. The divorce. Our marriage. What happens next? I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I stepped into the kitchen, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table. I didn't want to say too much, but I also knew I had to be careful. One wrong word, and this fragile piece could shatter into something far worse. I spoke to my lawyer, she continued, her gaze meeting mine. And I want this to be as smooth as possible. I know we can't go back to what we had, but I don't want to fight you. Her words, though soft, were laced with a sense of finality. There was no anger in her voice, no bitterness. just a tired resignation. I studied her for a moment, trying to read the emotions hidden behind her calm exterior. It was clear she was emotionally exhausted just as I was. But despite her calm demeanor, I knew she was still calculating, still thinking about what she could get out of this. "I don't want to fight either," I said, keeping my tone even. "But you need to understand something, Lauren. I've protected myself. I've moved assets into trusts. My company is separate property and it's staying that way. I'm not going to hand over half of what I've built just because we're ending this." Lauren's expression faltered, and for a brief second, I saw something in her eyes, a flicker of what might have been regret. But it was gone just as quickly, replaced by the cold mask she had been wearing for weeks. "I know," she said quietly. "I didn't expect to walk away with everything. I don't want to fight over the company or the assets. But I do need something. I don't have a career, Jason. I haven't worked in over 20 years. I don't know what I'll do when all of this is over." I felt a pang of sympathy. She wasn't wrong. Her entire life had revolved around me and the life we had built together. But at the same time, it was hard for me to feel guilty when she had made this choice herself. She had chosen to step away from her career, to stay home and support me while I worked. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I'll make sure you're taken care of. I'm not trying to leave you with nothing, Lauren. But I'm not going to give up my entire future because you're scared about what's next." She looked down at her tea, her fingers tapping the side of the mug. The silence between us felt heavy, but I knew there was nothing more to say. We both knew where we stood now. There was no going back. "I'm willing to offer you a fair settlement," I said, finally breaking the silence. "You'll be financially comfortable. But that's all I'm offering. I'm not going to let you take half of my company. And I'm not going to let this drag on for years. I want it to be over. For both of us." Lauren didn't answer immediately. She just sat there looking at her tea, her mind clearly elsewhere. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "I don't want this to be ugly, Jason. I just don't know how to get past everything. How do we move on from here? How do we walk away without hating each other?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at her. It wasn't easy to answer that question, but I knew the truth. There was no easy way out of this. It had been too many years of neglecting the real issues in our marriage, too many years of building our lives around things that weren't real. "We'll move on the best way we can," I said quietly. "But we'll do it separately. And we'll make sure it's as fair as it can be." Lauren didn't say anything else. She simply nodded, looking defeated. And I knew in that moment that we were both finally facing the truth. Our marriage was over, and there was nothing left to salvage. I left the kitchen without saying another word, the weight of everything settling on me like a physical burden. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time I was ready to face it. The days following my conversation with Lauren were filled with tension, but also a strange sense of inevitability. We were both moving forward, each in our own way, but neither of us was sure where the finish line was. I had done everything to protect my future, but the closer I got to the divorce being finalized, the more unsettled I felt. I kept my distance from Lauren, giving her space. She had started meeting with her lawyer more frequently, and I knew it wouldn't be long before she would take the next step. I kept to myself, focusing on work, but the cloud of the impending divorce hung over everything. It wasn't just the legal implications. It was the feeling of loss, the realization that a chapter of my life was closing. On the 7th day after our last conversation, I received a call from my lawyer, David. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "We've received an offer from Lauren's side," he said. "It's time to talk about settlement." I immediately agreed to meet. I had no interest in dragging this out any longer. I had protected what I needed to protect, and now I wanted to move on. David and I met at his office the following morning. The small conference room was sterile, the walls lined with books and legal documents. I took a seat across from David, my mind already running through the possible offers Lauren might accept. I knew she didn't want to fight, but I also knew that she had her own vision of what she deserved. David slid a stack of papers across the table to me, his fingers drumming lightly on the top sheet. "Here's what she's proposing," he said, his voice neutral. I picked up the papers and glanced through them. The settlement offer was straightforward. Lauren was asking for the Westchester property, a few of the joint investment accounts, and a sum of cash that would make her comfortable for the rest of her life. The number wasn't small. She was asking for $25 million. I raised my eyebrow. Is this really what she wants? It seems reasonable. David nodded. It's more than reasonable. It's actually quite generous given the circumstances. She's aware that your company is separate property, and she doesn't seem interested in dragging this through court. She just wants enough to start over, something she can live on without the need for further legal action. I looked down at the papers again. It was a far cry from the $150 million she had initially hoped for. I knew the settlement wasn't just about the money, it was about getting out without too much damage to either of us. It was the closest we could get to an amicable resolution, and at this point I had no intention of making it messy. "I'm willing to accept this," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. It wasn't ideal, but it was fair. But I want it wrapped up quickly. No more delays. I'm done. David smiled, though it was more of a professional gesture than a sign of satisfaction. "Understood. We'll respond with your agreement. I'll draft up the paperwork and have it sent to her lawyer by the end of the day." I signed the papers, finalizing the deal. It was done. I had no more fights to fight, no more strategies to plan. The end had come. The woman I had once loved would walk away with enough to live a comfortable life, and I would hold on to what I had left of my business, my wealth, and my future. As I left the meeting, the weight of the decision settled on my shoulders. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel victory. I felt empty. It was the quietest kind of ending, one that felt like it had been building for years and now it was finally over. Later that evening, I returned home to find Lauren sitting in the living room. She was looking out the window, a glass of wine in her hand, but her posture was stiff, like she was waiting for something. I sat down on the opposite side of the room, not quite looking at her. We hadn't spoken much in the past few days, and there was no real need to say anything now. "I spoke to my lawyer," she said quietly, her voice soft. "I'm ready to move forward." I nodded, keeping my gaze on the floor. "I am too. I've signed the papers. It's done." There was a long silence before she spoke again. "Do you think we'll be okay? After all this is over?" I met her eyes then. "I don't know. But I'm not interested in making it worse. We both need to move on." Lauren stared at me for a long moment, as if she was trying to find something in my eyes that would explain everything. But there was nothing left to explain. Our time together had passed and the marriage we had built was gone. The person I had once known, the woman who had stood beside me through everything, was a distant memory. "I just want things to be over," I said, my voice steady but distant. "We've both done things we regret. Now it's time to start over." Lauren didn't say anything else. She just nodded as if accepting that it was the end. The end of everything we had built together. That night, I lay awake in bed, the weight of everything settling on me like a blanket of cold. I had won the battle for my business, but the cost had been greater than I had imagined. I had spent years building something from nothing, but now I was faced with the reality that I had lost something far more precious along the way: the woman I had married, the life we had built, and the trust we once shared. It was over. A week later, I found myself standing in a sterile courtroom, the air thick with the tension of finality. It was strange to think that this was how it would all end. No dramatic confrontation, no emotional outbursts, just the cold efficiency of legal proceedings. We were both there, but we might as well have been worlds apart. The lawyer on my side, David, had assured me that the process would be quick. Lauren's lawyer, a sharp woman named Rebecca, had already presented the terms of the settlement. It was simple. Lauren would receive the Westchester property, a portion of the joint accounts, and a lump sum of $25 million. In return, she would relinquish any claim to my company and any further involvement in the division of our assets. The judge entered, a woman in her late 50s with a no-nonsense attitude. She acknowledged us with a curt nod, signaling the beginning of the proceedings. "Mr. Houghton, Ms. Grant," she began, looking over her glasses at us both. "It looks like you've come to an agreement regarding the divorce settlement. Is that correct?" We both nodded silently. Lauren was seated beside her attorney, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked composed, almost as if this was just another business deal. I couldn't help but feel a sense of finality in the room, a heaviness that seemed to hang over everything. "Then let's proceed," the judge said. "Mr. Houghton, Ms. Grant, I trust the terms of your agreement are clear. If there are no further objections, we can proceed with the formal dissolution of your marriage." I looked over at Lauren. Her eyes met mine briefly, but there was no recognition in them, just a quiet resignation. She seemed at peace now, the anger and disappointment gone, replaced with something I couldn't name. Maybe it was relief. Maybe it was something else. I signed the papers first, the pen feeling heavier in my hand than I expected. Each stroke of the ink was like another chapter closing in a book I didn't want to finish but knew I had to. I looked up as Lauren took the papers from the clerk, her hand trembling ever so slightly before she signed her name. It was over. Just like that. The judge gave a small nod and we were dismissed. No dramatic moments, no last words, just the dull finality of paperwork and legal agreements. As I walked out of the courtroom, I found myself feeling strangely numb. The past few weeks had been a blur of decisions, strategy, and careful planning. But now, as I stepped into the bright sunlight, it all felt so insignificant. I had protected my wealth, but at what cost? I could hear the murmur of voices behind me, and for a brief moment, I turned to look. Lauren was standing a few feet away, talking quietly to her lawyer. She looked nothing like the woman I had married, nothing like the woman who had been there with me when we were building our life from the ground up. But she was still there, still living in the world that I had created, just as I was. I walked away from the courthouse without looking back, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the quiet street. I felt nothing. No relief, no regret. Just emptiness. That evening, I sat at my desk in the office, the city lights twinkling below. The silence in the room was deafening, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the weight of my own isolation. The company was doing well, better than ever in fact, but it didn't seem to matter anymore. All the wealth, all the success, had been built on a foundation that was now crumbling. The thing I had once built my life around, the thing I thought I was doing it all for, was now gone. I picked up my phone and looked at the few messages I had received throughout the day. My daughter, Julia, had texted me earlier to confirm that she would be coming home next weekend. Her words were simple, warm, and yet distant. She hadn't called in days, hadn't asked about the divorce. I couldn't decide if I was relieved or upset by it. I put the phone down and stared at the skyline outside the window. The city stretched out before me, sprawling and indifferent like everything else in my life. It felt so vast, so lonely. How had it all gone wrong? A knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. It was David, my lawyer, holding a file in his hands. "Everything's finalized," he said, setting the file down in front of me. "Lauren signed the agreement. The settlement's all wrapped up. It's done." I looked at him, my mind still drifting between the past and the present. "It's done, huh?" David nodded. "Yes. No more back and forth. No more delays. You can move on now." I didn't feel like moving on. I didn't feel like doing anything. The battle was over, but somehow it didn't feel like I had won. The quiet that followed felt suffocating. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, I guess it's done." David didn't say anything else. He stood up to leave, but before he walked out of the office he paused at the door. "You know, Jason, for what it's worth, you did the right thing. You kept your integrity intact. There aren't many people who can say that after something like this." I didn't respond. What good was integrity if everything else had fallen apart? As he left, I sat there in the silence, staring at the papers on the desk. My future was secure. My business was secure. But what about the things that really mattered? The things I had taken for granted while I was focused on building this empire? The truth was, I didn't have the answers. I didn't know what came next. I only knew one thing: everything had changed. And there was no going back. The weeks that followed the finalization of the divorce were both strangely quiet and intensely loud at the same time. The silence in my home was overwhelming. The absence of Lauren's presence, once so familiar, was now suffocating. Her departure had left a space that seemed impossible to fill, and no matter how hard I tried to throw myself into my work, that emptiness followed me everywhere. I went through the motions, attending meetings, making decisions, signing contracts, overseeing the growth of the company I had worked so hard to build. But at the end of each day, when I sat in my office alone, the weight of everything seemed to hit me harder. The success I had fought so long for now felt hollow. It was as if I had reached the top of a mountain only to realize that there was no view waiting for me. Lauren had moved out of the Westchester house and found a small apartment closer to the city. Julia, our daughter, had been visiting occasionally, but her life was moving on. It was clear she didn't fully understand the complexities of what had happened between her mother and me, and I wasn't sure if I should tell her. Part of me wanted to shield her from it, to pretend like everything was still intact. But I knew I couldn't keep hiding the truth from her forever. I tried reaching out to Lauren a few times, but our conversations were brief and strained. There was no bitterness between us now, just a quiet distance, a final acknowledgement that we had both moved on. I didn't know if it was what I wanted, but it was what we both needed. One afternoon, I found myself at the same cafe I had visited on countless business trips, a place I used to go to clear my head, to step away from the demands of work. As I sat down with my coffee, I stared out the window, watching the world go by. The city felt different now. It was the same city, the same streets, but it felt somehow more distant, more isolating. I had everything I had worked for, but somehow I didn't feel whole. A few minutes later, I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned around, half expecting a colleague or business associate, but instead, it was someone I hadn't seen in a long time, Julia. She was standing there, looking uncertain, but her face softened when she saw me. "Dad," she said quietly, taking a seat across from me. "I thought I'd find you here." I smiled at her, trying to mask the sadness I felt. "What brings you to this part of town?" "I wanted to talk," she said, her voice serious. "About everything." I nodded, putting my cup down. "Of course. What's on your mind?" She hesitated for a moment, her fingers nervously twirling a strand of hair. "Mom told me what happened." "Well, some of it." She didn't go into too much detail, but I can tell it's been hard for both of you. And I don't know what to think about it all. I felt a lump form in my throat. I hadn't expected her to bring it up so directly, but there it was, the truth we had both been avoiding. "It's been tough, sweetheart," I said quietly, trying to find the right words. "It's not something I ever wanted to happen. Your mother and we just grew apart. Sometimes things don't work out even when you try your best." Julia nodded, but I could see the sadness in her eyes. "I get that. But it's hard to see you two so distant. I don't know what to believe. Mom says it's all okay, but it doesn't feel okay. And now, with everything happening, it's like the world's changed. I feel like I'm stuck in the middle." I reached across the table, placing my hand on hers. "I'm sorry, Julia. You shouldn't have to be in the middle of this. It wasn't fair to you. But your mom and I both love you. That hasn't changed." She gave me a weak smile but didn't say anything for a long time. We just sat there in silence, the weight of everything pressing down on both of us. Finally she spoke again. "Do you think you'll ever find someone else? Someone who makes you happy again?" The question caught me off guard. It was too soon to even consider, wasn't it? How could I possibly think about another relationship when everything felt so broken? But I knew she was asking because she was worried about me. She wanted to know if there was hope for me, if I could heal from all of this. "I don't know, sweetheart," I said after a long pause. "I don't think I'm ready for that yet. I'm still figuring things out. Right now, I'm just focusing on work, on making sure everything is stable. I'm not in a rush to move on." Julia nodded again, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Just don't forget about yourself, okay? Don't forget that you deserve happiness too." I squeezed her hand. "I won't forget. I promise." She smiled softly and stood up to leave. "I'll call you this weekend. Let's do something, okay?" I nodded. "That sounds good. Take care, Jules." As she walked out of the cafe, I sat there for a while longer, the weight of her words lingering. I hadn't realized how much I had been neglecting myself in all this, how much I had poured into my work and my success, forgetting about the relationships that truly mattered. Maybe it was time to start focusing on the things that were truly important, not just the things I had built with my hands but the ones I had built with love. As I sat there, the realization hit me hard. The world had changed. But maybe, just maybe, I could still find a way to change with it.